You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Few topics today engender as much immediate controversy as those of Israel, the ongoing war in Palestine, and what a Christian response to that should be. Many Christian social media feeds have been dedicated to nothing else for about 6 months now. But what is the history behind all that? And what does the Bible actually say about Israel and Christianity's relationship to it? Find out coming up. Technically, this is a question and response episode, but I am here solo with you all this week because we only have one question that we are going to be addressing. And yes, it is going to take the entire episode. It could probably take its own series, but I'm going to do my best to be as not long-winded as possible. This is a question that I will be completely honest with all of you listening. I have been avoiding answering on the podcast for a little while now. This has been asked a few times now. And the first time, I kind of just privately messaged the person back and gave them a short response. Again, as short as I can. But I didn't want to address it on the podcast because of the massive controversy that there is around it. I didn't feel like I was prepared for that yet. I wanted to do more research and hear more perspectives and give a little more time to current events as well. But then a second request came in that was very similar, and a couple of weeks ago, a third person reached out with basically the same question, and that's when I said, oh, okay, I can't avoid this any longer. People want to know what's going on with Israel. And I feel like since we have, it's a small platform, but we have a platform here, it's worth speaking into that. And I do believe that we are going to be able to add some information to the discussion today and hopefully get you all thinking about this from a different angle and hopefully a more full perspective of what all is going on. Remember, as always, with any of our question and response episodes, this is not a question and answer. I am not giving you the once-for-all Christian perspective on how to view Israel and what our relationship to anything going on there is. I do not claim to have that authority. That would be a horrible thing to have. I do not want that kind of authority. So this is not question and answer, it's question and response. So I'm going to give you a Christian response, and we'll talk about some others as well. But let's look at the question that was sent in, and this is specifically the most recent one because it kind of covers all that has been asked before and adds a little bit more. But the person asks, in the Old Testament, God commanded Israel to kill everyone, women and children included, in battle. Does God view war differently in the New Testament and today? With everything going on in Israel, Christians are divided on how to feel. The Bible says that any nation that goes against Israel will be punished, but then I hear some other people say that the Israeli government is satanic and shouldn't be supported. The lives lost on both sides are sad. How should we view that conflict? So, yeah, real easy topic this week, right? What could possibly go wrong talking about this? Let's have some disclaimers right up here up front before we get into any more of the conversation. First, I realize that no matter what side you take on this issue, people are going to hate on what you say. You can say something as simple as, lives lost are sad and I don't want to see people die, and everyone will attack you from the left, from the right, from the center, from everywhere in between. Okay, this is the kind of issue where you just cannot win. So I realize that going up front. I ask that you give us a little bit of grace on this as well. And, whatever your perspective on this is, just take a breath, set that aside for a second, and just listen to the history of what's going on, and then also the biblical background of it. And then you can pick it up again later, but just realize I am not trying to convert anyone to my singular point of view on this. I am not telling you how you have to view Israel or the ongoing conflict there. Just trying to give some information, mainly on history and the biblical background, because those are the areas I'm nerdy in. But this is, as always, something that we can disagree on and still be Christians. Still love God, still love Jesus, still love the Bible, still love people, and disagree on. And that is okay. I have seen way too many people, both in person, people that I know, and then also on social media, especially Facebook, get way up in arms over this issue. I mean, it is disproportionate the amount of focus that many evangelical and fundamentalist Christians place on anything related to Israel. And you would honestly get a less vitriolic response from people if you made a statement about homosexuality or about Trump or Biden, or honestly, you could say that Jesus was a human and not the Son of God, and you would get less of an angry response from many Christians than you would if you questioned their view on Israel. Now, I know our community here is way better than that, so let's not be like that today. Let's just dialogue, talk through some of this, listen to each other, and realize that good people can come down in some different ways on this issue. I also want to define some terms going in, and I'll try to get as many in up here up front that I can, but I'm sure I may miss something as I go on, so I may need to define on the fly. But these will just be some helpful terms for our discussion moving forward. First one is going to be talking about Israel. Now, I'm going to be going back and forth talking about ancient Israel and modern Israel, but I want to point out that those are two separate entities, and we'll talk more about this throughout the episode. But just because they share a name does not mean that the entity is exactly the same. There was almost a 2,000-year gap between the last time that Jewish people had a land to call their own and where they are today. So there is absolutely a relation between those two entities. But I mean, think about going back 2,000 years for literally just about anything else. We're not going to assume it's the exact same thing. I mean, so much has changed in just 100 or 200 years, let alone almost 2,000 years. I mean, it's hard enough sometimes to trace our own genealogy back a couple hundred years to get back to medieval times, and we feel so detached from those people a lot of times because they're, great 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 grandparents, and they were just such a different entity even though they share the same blood and DNA to a degree. So multiply that several more times and you get a little bit of an understanding of the difference between ancient Israel and modern Israel. Another important distinction there is that there is actually a difference between an Israelite and a Jew. And these terms are often used interchangeably, but an Israelite is the correct term for a Jewish person living up until around the time of the exile. So from around the time Israel left Egypt in the book of Exodus until around the time of the exile, they are called Israelites. And that comes from the name that God gave to Jacob in the book of Genesis, said his name would be Israel, so then the descendants become Israelites. Before that, the best term would probably be Hebrews, which is disputed how exactly that comes down, but the general idea is that probably came from Genesis 10, where one of Abraham's ancestors is named Ever. It looks like Eber in a lot of English translations, but Ever, and you can hear maybe a little bit of Hebrew in Ever, Heber, Hebrew. Yeah, you get a little bit of that. It's also possibly related to the Hebrew word ivri, which would mean to pass over, and scholars connect that with Israel's crossing over the Jordan into the land, so they had to cross over into their land. They were a people that crossed over. Ivri and Ever also have the same three main consonants in Hebrew without any vowels, so there's a possible connection there as well. But then once Israel comes back from the captivity under Babylon, and this would be in the 600 to 500 range before, that's when the term Jew starts to be used to refer to the Jewish people. And that comes from the name of one of Jacob's 12 sons, Judah, because the Judahites were one of the two tribes that remained. Judah became known as the southern kingdom, while Israel was the northern kingdom. This is when the kingdom split after Solomon. Judah and Benjamin being the southern ones, but they just kind of collectively were known as Judah. And in Hebrew, you can take that name for Judah and essentially get Jew out of it. So that's where we get that connection there. Today, the term Israelite is not usually used to refer to someone living in the modern land of Israel. It's usually just the terms Jew or Jewish person. And that's where it starts to get a little difficult too, because most nationalities don't necessarily tie in specifically with a religion. Like, if I say I'm American, that only tells you my nationality. It does not tell you what I believe in a religious sense. I could be atheist, I could be Christian, I could be any denomination of Christian, I could be Buddhist, whatever. I could be just about anything and be American. That goes for most of the world. But if you say I'm Jewish, that can mean one of two different things. That can either mean you are biologically of Jewish descent, or it can mean that you follow the Jewish faith. And those two things are not necessarily synonymous. You can have someone who is biologically a Jew, but who doesn't go to a synagogue or read the Tanakh or even believe in God. You can have a secular Jew. They are biologically Jewish. I guess I shouldn't say biologically, technically it's ethnically, but you get the idea. Their blood is of Jewish descent, but they can be any faith. It's completely possible. You could have a Buddhist Jewish person, you could have, this would be a little weird, but there's probably a Muslim Jewish person somewhere. That I can't imagine that's very common. And it can flip-flop too. You can have someone who is of a Jewish faith, but is not ethnically Jewish, a convert to the Jewish faith, just like I do not have a drop of Jewish blood in my body. I should say that up front as one of the disclaimers here. I do not have any Jewish blood in me. I am completely a Gentile. So I want to put that up as a disclaimer too, because as we start to talk about the ongoing war, I think it's important to realize that I do not have skin in that game, so to speak. And I think when we're talking about other people, the people we're talking about should be the ones who get to speak more so. We should be listening more to Jewish and Palestinian voices than we should be listening to the average American on Facebook who thinks that they have the answer to everything. So that's an important note too, is try to listen to people who are close to that particular matter. If you're trying to learn about, say a particular faith, say you're trying to learn about Islam, don't read what Christians say about Islam. Read what Muslims say about Islam. Go with the people who are close to the matter and know what they're talking about. So if this is something that you're looking into, listen to both Jewish and Palestinian voices, and listen to both of them more than you listen to the average American giving their 2 cents on socials. But anyway, yeah, you can have a person who is of Jewish descent and is not of the Jewish faith. You can have someone of a Jewish faith who is not of Jewish descent. It can go either way. So that makes it a little bit difficult. And really, it goes back to ancient times where pretty much every people group was related specifically to a certain deity. Like, you knew if you were going into the land of Israel, this was Yahweh's territory. You know that if you're going into the land of the Philistines, it might be Dagon's territory. Or if you're going into this region of the Canaanites' territory, that's Baal's, or fill in the blank with anyone. Whatever region of the world you lived in the ancient world, there was at least one, usually several, deities associated with that area. And so it was just understood, if I move to this area, if I become a part of this people, which didn't happen much. It's not like today where if I wanted to, I could up and leave everything here in America and I could go live in Ireland or China or fill in the blank, anywhere, and I could become a citizen of just about any country. That's not really how it worked. I mean, you could convert, you could move to an area, but you have to remember, travel was not easy. most people didn't travel far from where they were born in their entire lifetimes. So a person's identity was closely tied to the region that they were in. This is part of why, and I'm jumping ahead of myself here, but this is part of why there is so much conflict in the Israel and Palestine area, because those are people who have lived in that region for a couple thousand years. How long have any of us lived here in America? Well, unless you come from a Native American family, you haven't been here more than a few hundred years. How long has the average British family been in Great Britain? Well, that's going to depend a little bit, but even then, it's probably less than 1,000 years that you can go back. People groups change, and a lot of times what happened is you just had these tribes. You didn't have established national areas like you do today. I am way jumping ahead of myself, but hey, we're going to go with it. This is still background information that helps, so we should get out of the way. But I don't know, I just always have this mindset of like the globe or the map that we see today, and the boundaries of most countries haven't changed noticeably in over 50 years. Now, you get some in certain areas, particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union, some of that area changed hands, and that's even affecting the Russia and Ukraine conflict right now as well, too. I usually try not to date these episodes to a particular time period. I like them to be timeless, but that's just not going to happen today. There's too much wrapped up in the current events of this that there's no way around mentioning the time period that we're in right now. But yeah, national geography hasn't really changed much. And, sometimes you can even just see the outline of a particular country and immediately know, oh, that's America, that's Mexico, that's Canada, what have you. But in most of human history, that has not been the case. Territories change constantly, and it was just these little tribal factions that would live in the same general region. Many of them were nomadic, so they would travel around. And it was just smaller groups of these little tribes all around the world. And especially if we're here in America, it's kind of a weird sensation because we have these little mini things that we call states, but then we tend to identify more with the country than we do the state. But in reality, states are almost like little countries. America is really 50 little countries. And if you have ever crossed into a different state, you understand what I'm talking about. Like, there is a massive difference between state to state. It's basically crossing between countries. But we have to consider ancient people groups less in the terms of these massive nations we're thinking about today, China, Russia, America, Canada, these huge areas of land, and more just like the little states that we have. Israel is basically the size of New Jersey, as the land is today and throughout most of history in the Bible. But as we'll talk about, throughout that biblical history, the geography of Israel changed completely, the boundaries, constantly, because this nation would come in and attack and take a little bit of land. Israel would attack them, take a little bit of land. There'd be a merger between these two rulers, and so they gain a little bit more land. There's all these different things going on that is completely nebulous and constantly changing. So nations looked very different back then, and you didn't really get an opportunity to pick yours. You didn't necessarily go convert to a different religion. You didn't necessarily go get citizenship in a different country. You just lived where you were, and whatever the god the people of that region worshipped, that was your religion. So that was very much the case throughout a good majority of human history. Now, there have also always been decently sized empires or kingdoms. There was a lot of this in Africa, particularly in Egypt. That was one of the early empires, if you will, certainly in the far side of Asia as well. And in the Middle East, there were quite a few empires that came and went and conquered each other, going all the way back to even before the Assyrian Empire, but that's kind of one of the big ones that starts to affect Bible history. And then Assyria was overtaken by Babylon, which was overtaken by Persia, which was overtaken by Greece, which was overtaken by Rome, which kind of morphed into the Holy Roman Empire, which crumbled over time. And that is, wow, that is way too oversimplified. But if you can kind of take that time and then push it up to about the end of the Middle Ages, medieval times, life was still very much the same in a lot of ways as things back from ancient times. There was a lot of similarities. But as we started moving into an Enlightenment period and out of medieval times, you started having some different factions come into play as technology became more advanced. People started bonding in different ways over different things. People started traveling more so you could get to other areas. You could decide to live in other areas. But you still had this empire mindset of trying to expand a country's land. And that usually meant killing or enslaving the people whose land you took over. That was still very much that empirical mindset. That honestly goes all the way up into World War One. The two world wars had a lot to do with empiricism and one nation trying to rule over others and take over them. That really is only 100-ish years that it has not been the main way that nations try to get land. I realize there are still wars going on today, and we're going to be talking about one here today, but significantly less than there has been throughout most of human history, because we have had relatively stable borders for most of our countries for the last 50 to 100 years. It's kind of insane that that concept is so modern. We just don't even realize it. We've been born into this, and so we think that's the way the world has always worked, but that's not the way the world has always worked. There has been constant feuding over land, and usually when you think you're strong enough, you try to take another person's. If you have to kill them in the process, fine. If you can enslave them afterward, that's even better. And that sounds foreign to us, but it's not even been 100 years since that mindset has not been as prominent. So that's all going to definitely affect what we talk about here today. And before we go any further, let me also just kind of define the term for the land that we're talking about is often called Palestine. And that, as far as we can tell, dates back to about the time of the Greeks, where they gave the region, the part of the Middle East, it's often called the Levant, and it's the general area in between the Mediterranean Sea on the west and the Jordan River on the east. And then it'll go down toward roughly around the Sinai Peninsula and roughly around where Lebanon is in the north. So you kind of have this chunk of land there. It can go a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, but that's the general region. And it was called Palestine based on the Philistines who lived there before. So that's where the name came from there. Israel refers specifically to the land controlled by the government of Israel, which can take up a good portion of that land or just part of it. That is an area that has been contested on who controls what, and that's a big portion of the debate here. As mentioned just a second ago, Palestine derives its name from some of the earliest known inhabitants of the land, that would be the Philistines. Today, modern Palestinians are people of Arab descent and or who live in that land. So this is kind of like how the term Jew can have two different meanings. It can be a religious practicing person of the Jewish faith. It can be someone who is ethnically Jewish. So a Palestinian can either be someone who is of Palestinian descent, or it can be someone specifically living in that region of Levant in the Middle East. And when I say Levant, that's Levant, but it's that general region, someone who lives in that region. So it's a broader term than just Israel. People of Jewish descent are not Palestinians. People of Palestinian descent are not usually going to be Jewish. Now, again, the religion part of it can differ, but Palestinians are specifically Arabs, and Arabs are going to trace their lineage most of the time back to Abraham's other son, Ishmael. So this goes back to Genesis. Abraham has two children, one with his sex slave Hagar, and that child is named Ishmael, and then the other with his wife, and that is Isaac, who would later be an ancestor of the Jewish people. So you have someone coming from the line of Isaac, that is going to be the Jewish lineage. You have someone coming from the line of Ishmael, it is going to be Arab, or in this case, Palestinian. This is an oversimplification, by the way. Please realize each of these parts of the discussion could go on and on and on. So If I oversimplify it a little too much for you, just realize we don't have hours to go through this. This is probably already going to be longer than it should be. So give me a little grace in defining terms here. So that makes an important point that people of Palestinian descent and people of Jewish descent are distantly related. Now, that's a little hard to measure. I have seen a study or two that suggests there is some DNA evidence of that, but at least just going off of the biblical story, Jews and Palestinians both come from Abraham, and the only difference at the start is which son of Abraham they descend from. So that makes an important point here as well. Another term we need to address before we move any further is Zionism. And this is a modern movement that is centered around having a specific land for people of Jewish descent to be able to live in. The term comes from the Hebrew word Zion, which is the name of a mountain in the Bible, Mount Zion. Many English-speaking people will say Zion, but Zion. It's kind of a TZ sound in Hebrew. Jerusalem is on a plateau, kind of surrounded by mountains. It's in a mountain range. So you have Mount Moriah, which is often called the Temple Mount. And a little further south, you have Mount Zion. Throughout the Bible, that mountain is used kind of as a synecdoche to refer to Jerusalem, and then again to refer to Israel as a whole. So when the Bible talks about Zion, unless it's specifically talking about the mountain, it's usually a way of talking about Israel. So this term Zionism, it arose in the 1800s as there were many Jews around the world who wanted to have a homeland for themselves. Again, modern concepts of nationality are pretty different from the way that they used to be. Today, I don't necessarily have an ethnic homeland. I live in New Jersey. I am surrounded by people of all different ethnicities. My main lineage is Irish, but that doesn't mean that I have a bunch of Irish people living around me, right? I'm sure there are some in this region since we are still in New Jersey. You kind of get groupings of people all throughout, but even then, you have people who aren't of that nationality in that area. I mean, you can even go, if I go into Philly, there's an area of it that's called Chinatown. Well, not everyone who lives there is Asian. Now, many are, but still, not everyone is, and not all of them are Chinese. There are other Asian demographics there too. So it's not quite set up the same, where just the people who are like you of the same general blood live in the same area. Some parts of the world are still more like that. Like, again, I said I'm Irish. I can go to Ireland today, and there are a lot of Irish people there, but not all of them are Irish. People emigrate over there. So we have to realize that America is kind of a standout, and we can't judge the rest of the world or the rest of human history by it. There are other parts of the world where people who have lived in that one region have lived there for 1,000 years or more, and they can trace their lineage back. But especially the further time goes on, the more bloodlines mix. It used to be you married someone of your own ethnicity because they were the only people there. You didn't have a choice. But, when I was looking to get married, I didn't go and specifically try to find an Irish girl. In fact, I ended up marrying a girl who has a good bit of German blood in her. But that doesn't matter as much, at least not to me. I'm sure there are still people today who say, you're Irish, go find a good Irish girl. Or that think you come from this people group, you should be in that region. If you're Irish, you should live back in Ireland. Now, that sounds a little weird saying it that way today, but it is still prevalent in a lot of racist tendencies. You're not going to hear too many people say, you're Irish, go back to Ireland. But you might hear someone say, go back to the Middle East. Well, we're recently out of COVID. Go back to China. Or people talk about Mexican immigrants. Just go back to where you came from, right? That sentiment is still around very much today. We just don't realize it as much because there are just, or at least those of us who are white, because we don't have to worry about that. But, some people do still treat certain nationalities that way. And that's not right. And just as weird as it sounds to say you're Irish, why don't you go back to Ireland? That's how weird and stupid it is to tell Mexicans to go back to Mexico or Chinese to go back to China. That's not the way it works. And that's just racist and unhelpful. But many people do like having a land to call their own. If I were to go into Philly and walk around Chinatown, I would be the minority there. I would not see too many people who look a lot like me. Humans gravitate toward the people that are like them, that are familiar with them. If you go to a church, let's say a Baptist church, chances are you don't have too many Catholics show up there, or too many Methodists, or too many Buddhists. Why? Because we gather in groups that are similar to each other. And so there are a lot of people who like having a national homeland and living in that. And so this idea of Zionism came about in the 1800s because Jews had been without a specific place to call their homeland where they could safely live for close to 2,000 years at that point. Again, in biblical times and throughout history, national borders change and they ebb and flow as there's different battles and acquisitions and what have you. The Jewish people lost their land to Babylon at the time of the exile, but then they were allowed to go back under Persia. They were monitored but given a lot of freedom by Greece, monitored, given a little less freedom by Rome, and then eventually Rome destroyed the temple in AD 70 and sent most of the Jewish population out of that area in the next few years. So in less than 100 years after Jesus, honestly, in less than 50 years after Jesus, the Jewish people did not have a homeland. Now, some still lived there, but a large number were killed when Rome put down the Jewish insurrections. And then eventually, under the Holy Roman Empire, Jews were forbidden from being in Jerusalem. And so the number of Jews in Israel and Palestine went down significantly for a long, long time. And they scattered throughout the rest of the world, just like other people have done throughout history. Your people get taken over and you assimilate into the other cultures, and you retain some of your heritage. You keep some of the traditions, some of the stories, some of the language, but in many ways you become a part of the people who took you over. And so that happened in large part to the Jewish people, and Jews were all throughout the world. But once we started heading into the 1800s, a lot more anti-Semitism started creeping up, particularly in the Jewish communities in Europe. And before I go any further into that, I should define what anti-Semitism is, because this is absolutely a term that gets thrown around at anybody who disagrees with you on what stance to take on Israel. But anti-Semitism, this is going to come from the name of Shem, who was one of the sons of Noah, the son of Noah through whom we get the Semitic or Shemitic peoples, including Israel. So that's where you get this anti-Semitism. It is someone from the line of Shem who is experiencing racism against them. Now, I am using the definition straight off of the U.S. Department of State website, and it says that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community, institutions, and religious facilities. And then they give a few illustrations that I think help to clear up what they're talking about. They say manifestations might include the targeting of the state of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity. However, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. That's key. Anti-Semitism frequently charges Jews with conspiring to harm humanity and is often used to blame Jews for quote-unquote why things go wrong. It is expressed in speech, writing, visual forms, and actions, and implies sinister stereotypes and negative character traits. So it is racist to talk about, say, a Jewish conspiracy to control the media or to control all the world's banks. That is a racist stereotype. It is not racist or anti-Semitic to say that you disagree with something the nation of Israel is doing. I think that is an important clarification to make, because sometimes I see people critiquing the modern nation of Israel today, and other people jump on and say, oh, you're just anti-Semitic. No, it is very specific in this definition to say that criticism of Israel, similar to that leveled against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. So if you have someone today who criticizes the American government or the American military, that does not automatically mean that they hate America. I love being an American. I am thankful for the country I live in, but there's a lot of stuff our government does that I don't approve of. There's stuff our military does that I don't approve of. But you know what? They didn't ask me. Now, I can critique that. I can speak up about it, especially since we live in a democratic republic where I can do that. But that doesn't mean that I automatically hate America or want it destroyed or want everybody in it to die. So, same thing with Israel. You can critique what the nation is doing without saying, I hate Jews or I want Israel wiped off the face of the map. That is not what it means when somebody criticizes something that the modern nation of Israel is doing. Now, what's kind of funny is if you very specifically define anti-Semitism as being against someone of Semitic descent, that would also include Arabs and Palestinians, because they all come from Shem's line through Abraham. But most people do not accept that definition of it just because of all of the cultural connotation it has today. Anti-Semitism is usually used just of Jewish people. So it would not be appropriate in most cases to talk about antagonism toward Palestinians as being anti-Semitism. That's not usually the way the word is used, even though etymologically that would be correct. Okay, so all of that about anti-Semitism to say that as that arose in the 1800s, more and more people were starting to blame Jewish people for bad things that were going on in the world. You have to think about what's going on in the world in the 1800s. A lot is changing, and a lot is changing fast. You have trains for the first time. You have telegraphs for the first time. You have ways that people on opposite sides of a nation or even the world can start to connect with each other way faster than ever before. So a lot is changing. People are being given new information about the world. They're realizing that people exist outside of their little bubble, and they're being confronted with the world changing in massive, very rapid ways that it had never done before in human history. And that's scary for people. I mean, the same thing happens today. Why do you think you have older generations that tend to fear modern technology? It's because so much has changed since the time they were kids. You have someone who's 60 today, they remember a time before cell phones. They remember a time before the internet. They remember a time before email. They remember a time before car phones, right? They remember a time when cars actually looked pretty instead of just utilitarian. They remember a time before air conditioning, smoking in restaurants, and honestly, a lot of those things are even just within the last 30-ish years. And they had parents who talked about, the good old days where not much changed. It's only been in the last couple hundred years of human history that everything has changed so fast, and most of that just since World War II. So people get scared when stuff changes, and you look for someone to blame. And when you start realizing that there are people around who aren't like you, it's easier to blame them than to think that you or your tribe could potentially be part of the problem. So Jewish people became an easy scapegoat in a lot of regions for the bad that was going on in the world. People just assumed something bad's going on, someone's at fault, it's obviously not me, so, let's just blame them. And there was often a lot of violence that went along with horrible, inhumane treatment that no human being deserves. So as that began to rise more and more, you had more Jewish people saying, we need to get out of these areas where we're not welcome, and we want to have a homeland. We want to be somewhere where it's just people like us, people who understand us and aren't going to try to kill us or drive us out of the land. And so you had a couple of different forms of Zionism. This is part of the problem with the term Zionism too, is it gets used by people on different sides of the aisle to mean different things. It can be a religious term, it can be a political term, it can be an economic term. There's just so many different variations of it. And there were even earlier ideas of giving the Jewish people area in South America. I think maybe even in part of Africa. There were like a few different regions where people were going, what if we just let all the Jewish people live here? So Zionism was just about giving them their own land. It wasn't 100%, take back the land of Israel that David and Solomon reigned over, but it was mostly Jewish people wanting to get back to that general region. We'll talk a little bit more about how that went in a second here, but just dealing with this term Zionism, it is important to realize that now Jews live in that land. The term has morphed a little bit. Most technically, Zionism is just talking about having a land for people of Jewish descent to live in. But today it has taken on almost a meaning of like protecting the land that the modern nation state of Israel has. And for many Christians, it actually means taking over a large section of Palestine to match what many Christians believe is a biblical basis for the size that the land of Israel should be. So Zionism most basically just means if Jewish people want a place to call home where other Jewish people live, they should have it. Just like if I wanted to go be around a bunch of Irish people, I can move to Ireland. If you're German and you want to be around a bunch of German people, go to Germany. It's that sort of idea. They should have a place that they can call home. That is Zionism in its purest form. It has become much more politically and religiously motivated today, to where it is often meant in almost a colonizing sort of way or empiricist sort of way to say that the modern nation state of Israel should take over the entire region of Palestine that God promised to Abraham back in Genesis. So you can see how the different definitions of that word can get people's wires crossed when they're using that term. It's also important to realize that not every Jewish person is a Zionist. There are people of Jewish descent who do not believe that they are entitled to that chunk of the Middle East. And even for ones who believe that they should have a chunk of land in the Middle East, many of those don't support the idea that they should have this huge mass of land taken from Palestinians who live there today. So I wanted to bring that up because a lot of times we only get this one-sided perspective, but not all Jewish people are Zionists, and even the ones that would call themselves that are not necessarily meaning the same thing that a lot of Christians intend when they use that term. All right, how are we feeling right now? Let's just take a breath and reevaluate, because we've been talking for a while already. And this is just the foundation. This is just the groundwork. This is just the background that we're going through here. In a second here, we're going to talk about the history of the land and the conflict. And then we're going to take some time and talk about the biblical basis for a Christian understanding of Israel. And we'll end with a Christian response to this whole thing. So if you are scratching your head at this point and going, did you totally forget that this is a question response episode? Like, what happened to the question at the start? Don't worry, I haven't forgotten that. This was all just the foundation. I promise we weren't actually rambling, no matter how much it might feel like it for the last half hour here. All of that is important information you needed to know so that we can talk about the history and the biblical basis and a modern day reaction. We're going to get into that now. Stick with us. You're going to see how this all comes together. Let's talk now about the history of the land of Palestine and the conflicts that are going on there. People have inhabited this area of what we often call the Middle East. It's not so much called the Middle East anymore. Levant is a more preferred term because Middle East is kind of relative to America. It's only East if you're in America, and then you have the Far East in Asia. Well, what if you live in Asia? The Middle East is actually West. It's a very American-centric view, so we kind of tend to avoid using that terminology. But Palestine is a region of the Fertile Crescent, the Levant, the Middle East, whatever you want to call it, usually bordered on the west by the Mediterranean Sea, on the east by the Jordan River. Sometimes it bleeds a little further east than that. On the north, generally the region of Lebanon. In the south, generally around the Sinai Peninsula. Now, that region was inhabited very early on by different nomadic people groups. And there's all different sorts of tribes that lived in that whole region. It wasn't like it was just ruled over by one large people, a lot of little tribes. And some of the earliest that we're familiar with are the Philistines who came to that region. You get a lot of the names of these people in the Old Testament, the Tanakh. Generally, they are lumped under one massive term of Canaanites, because it's also called the land of Canaan, or Canaan in English, for the last few hundred years since our vowels shifted, even though that's not how it would be pronounced if we're just looking at the word itself. So Canaanites are usually just a lump sum term for any of the people living in the land of Canaan, kind of like how we use the term Palestinians today, even though you can have people of all different ethnicities that can be broken down within that. So you have the Philistines, the Hittites, the Perizzites, Jebusites, the mosquito bites, all the ites that bore people to tears when they come across those passages in the Old Testament. They usually fall under the main umbrella of Canaanite. And those are some of the earliest people that we know about living in that land. Then we get to Abraham, and we only have this record within biblical text. There is no record of someone named Abraham outside of this historically, so we're just taking the Bible story at face value here. And let me pause for a second and say, that may sound weird to some Christians, depending on where exactly you're coming from with this. In the tradition that I was raised in, the Bible was treated as the perfect, inspired, inerrant Word of God. It couldn't make a single mistake. Everything it said about everything was 100% perfect and accurate, and we just found some way to reconcile any possible discrepancy that people saw. However, there are many people who think that the Bible is not that. There are even Christians who don't necessarily view it that way. And so when we're talking about something historically, we have to kind of put aside our Christian assumptions and treat this as scientifically as possible, which means we have to treat the Bible like any other text. A historian is not going to look at some other ancient work, literally any other ancient work, and go, oh yeah, what they say is 100% true. That's infallible. That's from God. And we're making assumptions about that from the Bible. Now, you can believe that the Bible is all of those things, but we do not know that for sure. None of us have time traveled back to the time of the Bible and watched as whatever inspiration meant, God inspired these writers to write these accounts. As Christians, we take that on faith. As historians, you can't do that. You have to assume that the Bible is just as reliable as any other ancient book. And in some ways, it could even be more biased because a lot of the Bible is a polemic or an apologetic. It's trying to put just one particular version of the story forward. We have this especially throughout the Tanakh. You have this, it's basically Israelite propaganda. They're giving you their history, their story. It's like if you read an American history textbook today. We would have a lot of sections about the amazing things that happen in America, some section maybe on slavery and a couple others on injustice or the Vietnam War or something like that, but we're not going to talk a lot about the bad parts of American history. We're going to try to present a nice clean picture, and the times that we do talk about the bad things, we're going to put a spin on it that doesn't sound quite as bad. Well, the Bible's like that too, and that shouldn't scare us as Christians to say. I mean, just look at the stories in 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. They are presenting a particular perspective on those rulers based on whether or not the author liked them. And Pete Enns has done some great episodes on the Bible for Normal People podcast talking about how those texts are very much apologetic texts. They're propaganda in a way. So that shouldn't scare us as Christians. It's okay to acknowledge that. But if we're just looking from a historical perspective, we do not give the Bible any more or less weight than we would any other text. So this particular section, I'm coming at it more as a secular historian. I'm just looking at what do we know historically about this region. But then when we talk more about the biblical basis, I will come at it more from a Christian perspective and assume a little bit more about the Bible's truthfulness in those cases. So just want to make that distinction there, in case I scared anyone with the way I was talking about the Bible and historicity. We just want to make sure that we are being fair, unbiased, and realizing that if we were talking about a different aspect of Middle Eastern history and we had to use the Quran, a lot of Christians would be skeptical of how truthful it is, how much we can trust its account, whereas many Muslims would put more faith in it. So we have to realize it's kind of like that. We can't just assume that everyone else is going to also assume the reliability of a text that is important to us, but may not be important to them. So we have to be fair in how we deal with this. So when we're just talking about Abraham, we don't have historical record of him. There is nothing that says, oh, Abraham existed. Like seals have been found with David's name on it. So we're able to say there was more than likely a guy named David back then. There is nothing like that for Abraham. In fact, there's nothing like that for most Bible characters because most of them were nobodies. We have outside history records of some rulers, but not of these average people, and particularly not early on. So it's not something where we will ever likely find historical proof or reference to someone named Abraham. But within the biblical account, Yahweh appears to someone in the northern part of the Fertile Crescent, so this is above the land of Israel. Abraham did not live in Israel, he lived above it, in the city of Ur. And God said, I want to make a covenant with you, an agreement with you. In return for your servitude, for your fealty, for your worship, I will make sure that you have a lot of descendants and your people become numerous throughout the earth. We'll cycle back to that again when we get to the biblical perspective side of it. As already mentioned, Bible tells us that Abraham had 2 children, Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael through his sex slave Hagar, and Isaac through his wife Sarah. God promises both of those children that they will become great nations. In other words, a lot of people are going to descend from them. Now, those 2 kids, Isaac and Ishmael, did not get along, and that is representative of their descendants further along down the line. The Bible doesn't tell us a ton about Ishmael's descendants. In fact, they are often painted as the bad guys in the story, and that's because the Tanakh, the Old Testament, is the story of Israel. And it went to war with many of those cousins, if you will, in those other tribes. So, of course, they're going to be presented negatively. Now, you had a lot of different Ishmaelites throughout the land of Canaan. You had all different sorts of tribes that descended from him, as well as many that came from other areas. So just because someone was a Canaanite does not mean that they were an Ishmaelite, a descendant of Ishmael. Like the Philistines would have come from a different region. The Hittites descended from a different person. So you have a lot going on in this area. God supposedly tells Abraham that his descendants are going to live in this large chunk of land south of where he had been, and the general area where he had been a nomad since then. He had just been wandering around this land of Palestine. But God also said that would take a while to have happen. Again, we'll readdress all this in the biblical section in a few minutes here. But God said it would take a while for it to happen, so eventually Abraham's great-grandchildren, the sons of Jacob and their families, end up in Egypt. They're there for several hundred years. There's a lot of debate historically around what exactly happened there, but that's another issue for another day. Again, just coming at it from a historical rather than a biblical perspective at this point. They leave the land of Egypt, cycle around the general Sinai Peninsula area for about 40 years, and then eventually go into the land under Joshua. And this is where you have the conquest of the land. This is where you have them trying to take over. Now, we do not have historical record of much of what happens in Judges through 1 Samuel. A lot of times we kind of imagine these very massive, large-scale conflicts, and many of them may have just been smaller tribal battles that happened with a lot fewer people than we imagined. Again, historically, we do not necessarily have record of Israel coming in through the land and conquering it the way that the Bible presents it. Now, that does not necessarily mean that the biblical account is false. It is possible that we just have not found record of that up until this point. It is also possible that the biblical account is embellished as part of Israelite propaganda to make it sound bigger and better than it actually was at that point. Again, that should not be scary to us as Christians. That is not the same thing as saying the Bible lied. That is just saying we have to realize this is an ancient text written in an ancient context. And it was very common to have this sort of propaganda. That's not wrong. It doesn't take anything away from the Bible if we admit that. We have to let it be what it is in order to truly respect it. Forcing the Bible to be what we want it to be does not respect the Bible. Letting it be what it is respecting the Bible, and then we can understand it and appreciate it better. So there is record of many different battles happening in the land of Canaan or Palestine around that time, but not necessarily on the large scale that Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel present. There are also records of large-scale destruction, but in different time periods that don't quite match. So the puzzle pieces don't exactly fit there if we're just looking from a historical lens. But what is clear is that you have now this Jewish people that is coming into the land, and they are starting to think this land belongs to us by divine right. Now, I want to ask you to put aside your Bible believer Christian faith lens for a second. Take those glasses off and just look at this objectively. It's really easy for Christians to look at this and say, well, God said, take over the land, so whatever Israel did was justified. Now, I want you to think about 9/11. That terrorist act was performed by fundamentalists who believed they were following their God's desire. Do any of you listening believe that was actually the case? Do any of you listening actually think that God wanted those men that day to hijack planes and crash them into buildings? I highly doubt that. But they were so convinced that God was on their side, they were willing to die for it. If someone came to you today and said, God wants me to kill you, would you go, oh, well, if that's what God wants, that's what God wants, go ahead? Or would you go, are you out of your mind? What are you thinking? No, God absolutely doesn't want you to kill me. Why do we just automatically assume the validity of it when Israel does it in the Bible, and automatically assume that it's invalid when someone else does it? I know some of you would go, well, it's in the Bible and it's true. Okay, but think of it from outside of that context. I live here in New Jersey. Imagine if Pennsylvanians had a sacred text that said God wanted them to take over the land of New Jersey, march through, kill all the women and children. None of us would accept that. None of us would say, okay, yeah, that's cool. They're just doing what God wants them to do. And think about how that would come across if it happened to you. If someone came to your town and specifically got to your house with an army and said, we're going to kill you because our God wants us to. He wants us to live in this area. Sorry, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. That would not go over well. You can understand now why there was some fighting going on in the land. You have these foreigners, Israelites, coming in who did not live in that land previously. Abraham was a nomad there, but they had spent the last 400 years in Egypt. Do you realize America has not even been around for 400 years as a nation? Think about how long ago it feels. Just to get back to 1776. We're talking about, what, 250 years? Take us back to 1600. You don't even have the King James Bible yet. We're talking the time of Shakespeare, right? That is how long it had been since an Israelite, since a Jewish person had walked around in the land of Canaan. So imagine if you had a people who lived in America prior to the 1600s. They haven't stepped foot in the land since then, and now they come in and say, we're taking this over because our God doesn't want you to live here anymore. Can you understand how that would not come across well to the people who had been living in that land all along? Now again, I realize as Christians, we want to jump in and say, well, those people were wicked and evil and they did child sacrifice and everything Israel did was right because, God wanted them to take over the land. Okay, put all that aside and just look at this empirically. We're just trying to look at this as unbiased historians, not assuming a Christian bias, just looking at what happened. Can you understand why this would cause some problems? If you put yourselves in the shoes of the people living in that land, would you not be freaked out by this? Would you not have a problem that these people came in and took over your land? You don't believe in their God. You don't give a crap if he says that they should have your land. It's your land. Well, that's what happened when Israel went into the land. And that's why there's so much conflict in that land during Bible times, because you had these Israelites who came in and said, we're going to live here because we think our God wants us to. And you had all the people who were already living there going, we didn't get that memo. What are you talking about? The Israelites do take over a large portion of that land. At that time, they are broken up into tribes, very much like the original 13 colonies here in America. That's the best way I can describe the time of like Joshua and Judges, is basically if you just imagine the original 13 colonies, they're very much their own little nations. They kind of work together, but the slightest little thing could set off a war between them. They're just not on great terms. So that's what you've got going on in the time of the judges, moving into then the time of the kings, when you have what are basically local tribal warlords establish control over a section of the land. This is what many scholars think David actually was. They think that the biblical account of his kingdom is embellished and that he was basically a local warlord over a decent chunk of the land, but not quite as large as we may think, just based on the biblical account. His son Solomon then expands the territory greatly. He has all different kinds of military alliances and marries a ridiculous amount of women in order to make political alliances. But then the kingdom splits after his death into northern and southern parts, with his son Rehoboam taking the southern two tribes and one of his government officials staging a coup and taking the 10 northernmost tribes with him. This is all roughly 1,000 years before Jesus. The northern kingdom lasts for about 2 centuries and then is taken into captivity by Assyria. Most of those people just assimilate into the culture or they are killed in the ensuing conflicts and they never return back to the land. The southern kingdom lasts for a couple hundred years more, but then is in constant conflict with other nations around, eventually falls to Babylon, where, again, many are killed, many assimilate, but after about 70 years, those Jews get to go back into the land. Now, the land was not completely desolate or uninhabited in that time. In fact, you had some who were left in the land by the Babylonians, and you had some who were living in the region of Samaria, which was in the northern kingdom. This is where you start getting the Samaritans show up, and this is a whole other story for another day, but as the Jews start to come back under now the Persians, and you have Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel coming back, those men get very elitist and racist against their brothers who were in the Samaritan region and refuse to allow them to help rebuild Jerusalem and that surrounding area. So you then have the start of this Samaritan-Jewish conflict because Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel were kind of a-holes to their family members that were still living in that area. A lot of bad blood going on. Now, the Persians kind of revolutionized the way that ancient government worked, because people groups like the Babylonians would just wipe you out, take you into captivity, whoever was left. The Persians preferred to let you stay in your own land and just have some governmental oversight that eventually reports back to them. So under the Persian Empire, you had this whole massive region of the Middle Eastern area that was broken up into essentially different provinces that were ruled over by different governors. So this starts to become less about ethnicity and more about the politics of where the people over you drew lines. And so the conflict started becoming less about, kind of Hatfield and McCoy, like our people don't like your people, and more about we want some of your land, we don't like that the government put this person here, and it just became political feuding. That carried over into the time of the Greeks, into the time of the Romans. By the time of Jesus, there were a lot of Jewish insurrections going on. There was a lot of political instability in the air because these Jews were getting sick and tired of having people rule over them, and they wanted to be their own independent nation again. Eventually, Rome had enough of this, and they destroyed the Jewish temple in AD 70, and then spent approximately the next 60 years fighting on-again, off-again wars with remaining Jewish rebel factions. There are roughly 3 main wars that happened in that time, and by the time we get to approximately 136 years after Jesus, Rome had wiped out a good portion of the Jewish population in that area. Now, there were still some Jews living there. There were definitely Samaritans, but there was a lot of people coming in from other areas now that the Jews were either killed or driven out of that land. And you get some Persians coming in. You start getting a lot of Muslims coming in the mid-600s CE. Now, Muslims also read and follow the Bible in addition to the Quran. So they saw Jerusalem and Israel as a holy land and went on a holy war in order to regain control of this region after it had faced so many military conflicts. The land changed hands within different caliphates over the next 400-ish years, but it mostly remained under Muslim control, and you mostly had Arabs living in the land. Now, once we hit close to 1100 CE, we start getting the Crusades, and this is when the Holy Roman Empire, the Catholic Church, wanted to take back the land of Israel from the Muslims. There was a tenuous relationship going on for pilgrims who wanted to make trips to Jerusalem. Sometimes it was allowed, sometimes it wasn't. A lot of times it was dangerous. So the Christians say, we want to take back this land so that we can go there for our pilgrimages and also just for the symbolism of it. So that's when you have the Crusades. Most of them were trying to take back the land of Palestine, and for the most part, they failed spectacularly, and also failed to be a good representation of the Christian faith in the meantime. But the land, in many ways, remained under Muslim control. It kind of switched hands back and forth. And there's a little bit of conflict as you have like the Mongol Empire from East Asia coming into Syria-Palestine at that time, probably around the mid to late 1200s. At that point, they're starting to make some pushes into that, but are mostly rebuffed by the people in that area. In the late 1400s CE, you had a group of people called the Turks from kind of the Central Asian area, Central Eastern Asia, move into the Syria-Palestine area, and particularly the Ottoman Turks. And the Ottoman Turks start fighting with the Arabs that had been in the land for the last 700-ish years. They gain power there, mostly by around 1600. The Ottomans have controlled the entirety of Palestine. It is no longer called Palestine under their rule. It is a part of the Ottoman Empire. So by the time that the King James translation is being written, the land of Palestine is actually a part of the Ottoman Empire and under control of these people who had come in from Central Asia into the land. There are still some Jews in the area, there are still some Arabs in the area, but it is now part of the Ottoman Empire. And there's fights and power struggles and land changes hands and all sorts of fun things in 300-ish years there, but it was still under the Ottoman Empire. This takes us all the way up to World War I. In World War I, the Ottomans chose to support Germany and the Central Powers. Now, you can imagine the Allies didn't like that very much. So when they realized that there was a growing number of Arabs who did not agree with the Ottoman Empire and wanted a change of government for their land, the British saw an opportunity to get them on their side. So the British formed a secret agreement that's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, promising to the Arabs of that region their own independent Arab state if they would revolt against the Ottoman Empire, thus weakening the Central Powers' control in the Middle East. So basically, a bunch of Arabs want to take control of Palestine over from the Ottoman Empire. They don't have the power to do that. The British don't like that the Central Powers now have an ally in the Middle East. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And they say, okay, if you Arabs will fight against the Ottomans, help to overthrow them, weaken their power there in the Middle East, we will give you your own land that we do not try to conquer. Remember, this was still very much in the imperialist, colonialist time where empires like Britain were trying to gain more territory. So this was a big deal that they were saying, we will not try to take control of your territory if we win. We will let you control it yourselves. But there was a little snag in the plan. Because you remember when we were talking about Zionism, we said it came about in the 1800s as more Jews wanted to have a land to call their own. Well, this is shortly after that. And so there's another secret agreement that's called the Balfour Declaration. And this is named after Arthur Balfour, and he was the British foreign prime minister at the time. This Balfour Declaration promised Jewish people a quote-unquote Jewish national home within this land of Palestine. So now you have Britain promising two different people groups a part of the same land. And there's a lot of debate over what exactly the plan was here. Some people think that Britain was basically trying to play both sides here, make the Jewish people happy by saying, we will give you a land, while also making the Arabs happy and saying, we'll give you a land. And it just so happened to be the same land. Some people think they were trying to set up a two-state solution from the start, but a lot of this was very secretive communication back and forth at the time, so it's hard to know exactly what the original plan was. But after the First World War, Britain ends up in charge of this region. Under the League of Nations, they control the land of Palestine from 1920 until 1948, and this is called the British Mandate. The beginning of that mandate reads that Britain should be responsible for putting into effect a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This is, quote, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, the Brits did their best to uphold this, but it was pretty tumultuous and not everyone agreed on what exactly was supposed to be going on. There was also some transfer of land in that region back and forth under British and French control, but the Brits did allow for an influx of Jewish immigrants into the area in that time. At the end of World War I, there were only roughly 60,000 Jews living in the general area of Israel. Now, that was less than a tenth of the population of the whole land of Israel. So we're talking 1920, roughly, Jews make up less than a tenth of the land of Israel. By the time the British Mandate ended, by the end of World War II, the Jewish population was equal to the total population of Israel back just 25 years earlier. The Jewish population in Israel in just those 25-ish years multiplied 10 times over. They now represented approximately 30% of the population in the land of Israel. So as you can imagine, the Arabs who were living in Palestine at that time and who had been there for several hundred years at this point were not loving what was going on. Again, Israel is about the size of New Jersey, so imagine if New Jersey had about 600,000 people living in it. It actually has over 9 million, but to compare it to Israel, imagine 600,000 people lived in the entirety of New Jersey. And then imagine that 25-ish years later, 2 million people lived in New Jersey, with 600,000 of those people coming in from a totally different part of the world and believing that they have some right to a large portion of New Jersey because they used to live there 2,000 years earlier. I am not taking sides here, and I am not trying to sway anybody one particular way or say that Jews should not have gone into the land. I believe that people should be able to have a place to call home. I am not against Jewish people having a home. I want to make that clear. But in order to understand the current situation today, we have to understand this history, and we have to present it honestly. Again, I am not trying to say here that right now, today, as of 2024, Israel or Palestinians are correct. I'm just trying to say, imagine what would happen if you lived in New Jersey with 600,000 people, and in 25 years, another 600,000 people that have absolutely no relationship to you, and in fact have been at odds with you for 2,000 years, just immediately came into your land. So your population doubled, but by people who are nothing like you, while adding on another 600,000 people of just different areas that came in that time too. Like, it makes sense that the people who were living there would be freaking out over all of this happening. So we get to the end of World War II, and British control of the area is coming to an end. The British Mandate was set to expire on May 15th, 1948. In anticipation of that, David Ben-Gurion, a Jewish political figure of the time, declared the establishment of the State of Israel the day beforehand. So Britain is about to remove its hands entirely from the area, which is going to remove a lot of protections from the Palestinians in that region. And less than 24 hours before that happens, the Jews set up an official nation state of their own governance. Uh, Obviously, the Palestinians there did not appreciate that. So, in less than a week, from virtually every side, you had Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, Iraqis, Egyptians that all tried to rush in and stop Israel from getting established in that land. The land had shrunk since the original guidelines of the British Mandate. So as Israel fights against these invaders that are thinking Israel is an invader, they take back a large portion of what the original British Mandate was. About 3/4 of it. About a month later, all parties come to a very uneasy truce and re-divide up the land of Israel into some different portions run by different people groups. Now, it's important to know that on the same day Ben-Gurion declared Israel a state, the Palestinians declared a new Arab League that came into effect a few months later. They claimed control over the whole region of Palestine, but actually pretty much only controlled the Gaza Strip, which is in between Egypt and Israel along the Mediterranean Sea. It becomes a very hotly contested piece of land, even though it is extremely small. It's barely a third of the size of the county that I live in. That takes us up to 1967, which is the Six-Day War. Israel, by this point, had recaptured the entirety of the British Mandate land. It took that Gaza Strip. It also took the West Bank, which is up in the more northern section of the land. It's on the north side of the Dead Sea along the Jordan River. It's essentially the region that Jesus would have ministered in during his lifetime. Egypt and Syria did not like that Israel had taken that land back, so they were threatening war. Israel decided to preempt that, fought against them, and occupied more territory. And this is what happens for the next several decades, pretty much taking us up to today, is you have threats from the neighboring nations that they are going to do something about Israel. Israel doesn't like that. They go to war. Israel takes a little bit of land. The Palestinians really don't like that. International communities say, give some of the land back. Israel gives a little bit of the land back. The Palestinians want more land back. Israel's ticked off that they just gave some land back. And it just goes back and forth, back and forth. You have this with the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War. And you have some very, very tentative peace agreements, especially in the 90s. But even then, there is pretty much consistent fighting going on in the land between some faction of Palestinians and the Israeli military. Now, many Christians perceive Israel as rightfully having ownership of that whole region and see the Palestinians as basically terrorists against the Israelites. And in just a second here, we're going to get into the biblical part, but just put that aside for a second, just one more minute, I'm asking you to hold that off, and imagine if you had people come to your neighborhood, your town, say, we lived here 2 millennia ago, and we want to come back into it. You would probably fight against them too. And if they were to take over your land, you would probably resort to guerrilla tactics too. You would probably fight dirty also. Now, I am by no means condoning any terrorist actions. I do not support any terrorist tactics going on. Using civilians and hospitals and churches and things like that as a part of your war effort is wicked, no matter who does it, and that should be condemned. But it is also very, very, very important to realize that not all Palestinians are terrorists. That is absolutely a stereotype that is not okay at all. Any more than all Muslims are terrorists. That is also a stereotype that is not okay, nor accurate. Now, there are some Palestinian fighters who use terrorist tactics, but that does not mean that the average Palestinian is a terrorist or a monster or a bad human being. There are even Palestinian Christians. Now, we don't always hear that side. You don't see that stuff on Facebook, but there are Palestinian Christians who are hurting over the conflict in their land. And this brings us to today. We're to understand exactly what has been going on over the last 6 months. We have to go back again to around the time of World War II. In between the world wars, a group of Muslims, Sunni Muslims, got together and formed the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. This was to promote Islam in Egypt and Palestine, and it spread significantly. And as Israel comes into the land as a nation, the Muslim Brotherhood does not do anything violently against them. It works more so through political reform, and it's trying to push back through that way. But then there is an offshoot from the Muslim Brotherhood that is called Hamas. And this is formed about 60 years later in the late 80s at the start of the first Intifada. The Intifadas were Palestinian uprisings against Israel being there in the land. In late 1987, an Israeli army truck crashed into a Gaza checkpoint and killed 4 Palestinians. So that set off this first Intifada, and at the same time led to the formation of Hamas. Now, Hamas is both a military and political entity. So while it did start fighting back through terrorist acts against the Jews in the land, it also gained political prominence among the Palestinians, so much so that in 2006, Hamas actually gained control over the Palestinian Legislative Council, effectively ruling over Palestine. So Hamas is not just some small terrorist organization fighting guerrilla warfare. It is actually a political entity in Palestine, a political party that is trying to claim ownership over that same land that Israel is trying to claim ownership over. And in the next several years, both sides continued to fight with each other over the land, occasionally taking steps into the territory that the other has claimed, both sides thinking that they deserve some of the territory that the other side says they have. And that all comes to a head on October 7th of last year. That is when several Palestinian military groups, not just Hamas but including it, invaded southern Israel, killing over 1,000 people and taking about 250 captives. Israel has since fought back, moving into a large portion of Gaza and carrying out several strikes against Hamas, while Hamas has continued to fight back. And this is where it starts to get really hairy, because this is current day, and news reports are going to vary pretty much just based on party lines. In America, if you are a Republican, you are going to see news about all of the atrocities of Hamas and the ways that we need to pray for Israel and how they're fighting to get their home back. If you are a Democrat in America, you're going to hear more about the sketchy doings of the Israeli military and about all of the innocent Palestinians who have been forcibly removed from their homes by Israel in the fight against Hamas. Some news sources will tell you that Hamas has beheaded, raped, murdered, burned, and done every other horrible thing imaginable to Israeli civilians. And then the next day, you'll see that some of that was possibly exaggerated. The next day, you'll see that Israel bombed a hospital. And then the day after that, you'll hear that it was actually mostly cleared out and it was a Hamas headquarters. The news we're getting is extremely partisan and extremely untrustworthy. And I'm not saying there's a better alternative. I'm not saying look to this news source instead of Fox or instead of CNN. There is a war going on, and a key part of war is misdirection and lying and misrepresentation of numbers. This is not just a one side or the other thing. Hamas is absolutely lying about their numbers and what is going on in the war. And so is Israel. That's just the nature of war. It's going to be a while before we can have a more objective stance on all the different events of what has happened. Hamas has absolutely done some horrible things that need to be condemned. And the Israeli military has done some really questionable things that should probably be condemned as well. And that's where it just gets really difficult, because Hamas has essentially said that it will not stop until Israel is destroyed and all Jews in the land have been killed. And now Israel has taken a stance that says we are not going to stop until we destroy Hamas. That has been the statement of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And it's really easy to say, well, if Israel would just stop fighting, we could have peace. Or if Hamas would just stop fighting, we could have peace. But when your enemy has said, I won't stop until I kill you, there's not really a lot of room for peace. And that's where both sides are right now. Hamas has said that they are going to continue until Israel is destroyed, and Israel has said we are going to continue until Hamas is destroyed. There is no in between for either military. And this is where it's important to realize I'm talking about the military here. I realize some people listening may not be comfortable with any criticism against Israel, but remember, it is not anti-Semitic to criticize the Israeli government any more than it is anti-American to criticize something that the American government does. And remember that the average Palestinian isn't a terrorist trying to destroy Israel. They're just normal people living lives. Don't get bogged down in TikTok videos and Twitter things you see about a bunch of civilians in Palestine that are saying horrible things about Jews. Some of it may be true, and that's wrong, but there are also parts of it that are staged terrorist activity. And same thing on the Jewish side. The average Jewish person living in Israel isn't looking to go out and kill every Palestinian that they see. They just want peace in their homeland. Whenever wars are fought, innocents get caught in between, and that is horrible, no matter which side they are on. It's not just an us versus them, good guy versus bad guy. And even though I believe it is completely fair to condemn any of the terrorist acts of Hamas, that is not the same thing as saying that all Palestinians are bad people who need to die. This conflict is very complex and is unfortunately unlikely to be settled without a lot more violence. Hey everyone, Colin from the future here. Future from the recording anyway, I guess it's all passed to you. But anyway, when we recorded this episode and we were first talking about it, we knew it was going to be a longer one just by nature of the subject material. We wanted to make sure we covered as many angles as possible, as fairly as possible. But we did not anticipate that it would end up being quite as long as it did. So we are going to split this episode roughly in half here, rather than giving you what ended up being over a 2.5 hour long episode to listen to in one sitting. We will split it up where this week we just talk through all of that background and the historical side of it, and then next week we will get into the biblical side and a Christian response. So I realize it's a little bit of a cliffhanger, but this also gives you an opportunity to take a little bit of a breather, take some time to think through all of this, because what we talked about this week is going to be very different than what you hear in church. A lot of times you just hear Bible verses thrown and you don't hear the whole history. So I know it was a whole lot of information, and where we stopped this week, you might be wondering what the point of all of it was or how it all connects. I promise you we get into more of that next week. We kind of tie it all together in a nice bow, at least as much as you can. So you really can't have this week without next week. So I highly encourage you, no matter what you thought of what we talked about this week, be sure to listen in again next week. But just for time's sake, it was easier to cut here. So this gives you a whole week to regather your thoughts, come back at it fresh, and hopefully in that time to stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. See you all next week. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.